and it is threatening businesses, exports, and entire economies. While Washington shuts the door, another global power is opening the gates, and that is China. As the US slams harsh tariffs on African exports, the rival China is stepping in, offering a zero-tariff lifeline to the continent. On the 31st of July, President Donald Trump announced a new round of reciprocal tariffs set to take effect on the 7th of August. Several African nations are now facing the heaviest duties, just like the rest of the world. Africa, too, is adjusting to the new reality of this tariff war. South Africa, Libya, and Algeria face a 30% tariff, the highest in Africa. Tunisia has been hit with a 25% levy. 18 other countries across the continent face a 15% duty under the new policy. No trade deal was reached between Washington and any African nation before the deadline, despite multiple attempts from the continent to negotiate avoidance. Now, Africa's place on the White House priority list remains clear and low. Reactions have been mixed. While some African nations are yet to respond formally, South Africa, which had been in talks for months, has called the tariffs unjustified.
Africa is changing the world, slowly at first, then suddenly. And today, the continent has taken a decisive step that has shocked Washington, unsettled Western analysts, and signaled a new era in global power. Africa is quietly cutting the United States out of key areas of influence: trade, diplomacy, technology, energy, finance, and even security cooperation. This is not a snap decision. This is the result of a decade-long shift in priorities. A shift driven by sovereignty, strategy, and the rise of new global partners. In Washington, it is struggling to understand what happened, and even more, why it can't stop it. To understand the full picture, we must begin with one truth. Africa no longer sees the United States as its primary gatekeeper to opportunity. Today's African leaders view the world through a multipolar lens, a world where Africa has options, leverage, bargaining power, and most importantly, independence. For decades, U.S. influence in Africa rested on three pillars: economic aid, security partnerships, and diplomatic pressure. But those pillars are cracking, not because Africa collapsed, but because Africa grew stronger. African governments are increasingly choosing alternatives to U.S. systems. New alliances, new financial partners, new trade blocs, and new strategic advantages that Washington never prepared for. Across the continent, American dominance is fading in areas once considered untouchable. In trade, African countries are turning inward and regional. The African Continental Free Trade Area, the largest trade zone on Earth, represents a future where African economies trade more with each other than with the West. That means less reliance on U.S. imports, U.S. standards, and U.S. regulatory influence. In infrastructure, America has been outpaced. Chinese, Middle Eastern, and increasingly South American partners are delivering roads, ports, railways, energy grids, and digital systems at a scale America simply hasn't matched. Whether Washington likes it or not, Africa is building without waiting for Western permission. In energy, African nations are renegotiating old arrangements that favored foreign companies, demanding better terms, local content, and national control. From oil and gas contracts to new green energy projects, Africa is no longer giving away its resources for cheap. This alone has dramatically reduced Western leverage on the continent. In technology, Africa's digital future is being shaped by partners who are not constrained by the geopolitical limitations of the West. From data centers to fintech systems, Africa is choosing what works, not what Washington prefers. And in diplomacy, the shift is even more dramatic. African nations are voting independently on global issues, breaking away from U.S. influence at the United Nations and regional bodies. The era where Western nations could count on African support automatically is over. This is the context behind the headline. Africa is cutting the U.S. out of key areas of influence. But the deeper question remains, why now? Why is Africa making this move? The answer is simple and complicated. Africa wants sovereignty. Africa wants partners, not patrons. Africa wants equitable agreements, not lopsided deals. Africa wants to shape its future, not be shaped by outside powers. For decades, African nations relied on Western aid, Western business models, and Western political frameworks. But the results were mixed. Economies remained dependent, industries remained small, and structural adjustment programs weakened the very foundations needed for growth. Today's African leaders know this. The new generation is not interested in dependency. They want control. They want leverage. And they are willing to challenge global powers to get it. This is why Africa is turning to new alliances. Not because these partners are perfect, but because they offer options, alternatives, and bargaining power the West never allowed. Washington, once confident in its influence, is now realizing that Africa's priorities have changed permanently. The United States is still a major global player, but it no longer has exclusive influence over Africa, and that is what Washington cannot stop. Africa is diversifying. Africa is negotiating differently. Africa is demanding respect. And Africa is being led by a generation that is unafraid of global consequences. All of this feeds into the central reality. Africa is cutting the US out because Africa finally can. Economically empowered, strategically positioned, demographically unstoppable, politically awakened, technologically evolving. This is a continent stepping into its era of power. For Washington, the challenge is profound. The old playbook is failing. The old assumptions no longer apply. The old tone of control no longer works. Africa is rewriting the script. And the world is watching a new global power, not a country, but a continent, rise and reshape everything. Africa is no longer waiting for permission. Africa is no longer following scripts written abroad. Africa is choosing its partners, designing its systems, and building its own future. The message is clear, powerful, and irreversible. Africa is rising. Africa is resisting. And Africa is cutting the US out, not out of hostility, but out of sovereignty. Washington can't stop it, because this time, Africa is in control. Africa's decision to cut the United States out of key economic, strategic, and diplomatic channels is not an accident. It is not a temporary disagreement, and it is not a negotiation tactic. It is a deliberate shift, decades in the making, now unfolding in real time. The US is watching it happen. Washington is trying to respond, but the momentum has already passed the point of control. Part 2 goes deeper into why Africa made this move, why Washington can't reverse it, and what this means for the future of global power. The true breaking point: for years, African nations relied on Western systems for trade, loans, development funding, and political approval. But Washington's approach became predictable: high-interest loans, heavy conditions, political pressure, economic demands, and a system where the U.S. benefited more than Africa ever did. African leaders finally reached a conclusion: the cost of working under U.S. influence was higher than the gains. That realization created the first spark. Africa now has multiple pathways for trade and investment, and none of them lead through Washington. Countries are making direct deals with China, India, Russia, Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Indonesia, regional African blocs. This diversification removed America's most powerful weapon: dependence. The U.S. cannot threaten to cut aid because Africa no longer needs it. The U.S. cannot stop loans because Africa now has alternatives. The U.S. cannot control trade routes because Africa now builds its own. The game changed the moment Africa realized it had options. For decades, Washington used three main levers to influence Africa: aid, military cooperation, dollar dependency. All three are collapsing. African nations are dumping dependency in favor of partnerships that treat them as equals. Aid is being replaced by investment. Military bases are being replaced by local alliances. And dollar dependence is being replaced by local currency swaps and regional payment systems. This is why Washington can't stop the shift. The levers it used no longer work. U.S. foreign policy in Africa rarely prioritized industrialization. Washington wanted Africa to export raw materials, not finished products. But things changed once African nations realized something crucial. Any country that exports raw materials remains poor. Any country that exports finished goods becomes powerful. Africa is now choosing power. Countries are building refining plants, processing facilities, manufacturing hubs, tech incubators, local currency zones, regional payment systems, intra-African trade corridors. These structures cut the U.S. out naturally. because they no longer require American approval or American dollars. Washington underestimated Africa's youth. Africa is the youngest continent on Earth, the fastest growing workforce, the next global market, the next global industrial base, the next global tech frontier. While the U.S. focused on controlling Africa's past, Africa focused on building its future. Now that the future is here, Washington is behind, and catching up is nearly impossible. The U.S. faces a simple problem. Every time it pressures Africa, Africa moves further away. And every time Africa moves away, another global player moves in, quickly. China steps in with infrastructure. India steps in with trade. Russia steps in with security. Turkey steps in with manufacturing. The Gulf steps in with investment. Brazil steps in with agriculture. And Africa itself steps in with regional alliances. The U.S. cannot isolate Africa anymore, because Africa is no longer alone. Western media once controlled Africa's narrative. Not anymore. Social platforms, African news channels, and independent media now expose U.S. political interference, economic manipulation, dollar dependency traps, resource extraction deals, trade conditions designed to limit African growth. With the truth out in the open, Africans became harder to influence, and Washington cannot rebuild that trust. The information monopoly is gone forever. African governments now negotiate from a position of strength. They know their value. They know their resources matter. They know their markets are rising. They know the world needs Africa more than Africa needs the world. This confidence is new and unstoppable. Africa is no longer asking for permission. Africa is no longer waiting for approval. Africa is no longer accepting conditions. Africa is no longer negotiating from weakness. And this is the true reason Washington can't stop the shift. Africa is acting independently for the first time in modern history. The United States didn't lose Africa overnight. It lost Africa over decades by ignoring African priorities, by underestimating African intelligence, by overusing pressure instead of partnership, by assuming Africa had nowhere else to go. Now Africa has moved on, and the world has moved with it. Africa didn't close the door on the U.S. out of anger. It closed the door out of evolution. A new global system is forming, and Africa is choosing its own place in it, on its own terms, with its own partners, and for its own future. Washington can protest. Washington can warn. Washington can react. But Washington cannot stop it. Because Africa is no longer playing the old game. Africa is writing the next one.